Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from somewhere in Greece on August 9th, 2025 for Reason to Resist. The war criminal, Benjamin Netanyahu, has just announced a plan to occupy the Gaza Strip. Or has he? After days of leaks to the Israeli and Western media that Netanyahu had approved a plan to fully occupy the Strip, Israel's Security Cabinet met on August 7th to approve this so-called plan. But when the meeting was over, the Netanyahu regime announced that the new military operation would be limited and would be focused on Gaza City. The regime also avoided using the word occupy and said merely that it planned to, quote, take over Gaza City, close quote. Before Israel launched its genocidal rampage in the Gaza Strip in October 2023, the population of Gaza City was about 590,000 persons. At that time, the total population of the Gaza Strip was about 2.2 million persons. Since then, the population of Gaza City has swelled to roughly 1 million Palestinians, many of whom have already been displaced several times over and are starving. According to the Times of Israel, the plan under consideration would be phased and would require up to 5 months for completion, during which the million or so Palestinians in Gaza City would once again be forced into evacuation areas in southern Gaza. Israel's genocidal military would then establish compounds to house the massive influx of displaced Palestinians. As part of the plan, Israel and the US, we are told, would increase the number of aid distribution sites operated by the notorious Gaza Humanitarian Foundation from the current level of 4 sites up to 16 sites. Netanyahu has not yet presented a detailed plan on how Gaza should be governed in the future. But speaking to Fox this week, he gave a hint saying, quote, we don't want to be there as a governing body. We want to hand it over to Arab forces that will govern it properly without threatening us and giving Gazans a good life. That's not possible with Hamas, close quote. Now, before we get into the international response to this latest chapter in Israel's genocidal rampage, let's examine what led to this latest announcement. In March of this year, Israel tore up its ceasefire agreement with Hamas by refusing to remove its terrorist forces from Rafah, near the border of Egypt and Palestine. That is something it had explicitly agreed to do in the ceasefire agreement. Israel then began starving the population of Gaza and bombing it relentlessly. Then, in May of this year, Israel purported to launch a new military operation, which it dubbed Gideon's Chariots. The Gaza Health Ministry reports that since then, nearly 200 Palestinians in Gaza have starved to death, including 96 children. In addition, thousands and perhaps tens of thousands have been killed or wounded by bombs, missiles, collapsing buildings, bullets, artillery shells, and tank fire. At the time that Israel launched Operation Gideon's Chariots, Israel's war criminal defense minister, Israel Katz, stated that the main objectives of the operation were, quote, the defeat of Hamas in Gaza and the release of all the hostages, close quote. Israel has achieved neither of those goals in the 3 months that have elapsed since the operation was commenced. In the days leading up to the Security Cabinet's meeting on August 7th, Israeli media recognized this, reporting that Israel's military was drawing to a close this murderous military operation. And here is a headline from the Times of Israel on August 6th, and you'll see that the failure of the operation is highlighted in the headline itself. Operation Gideon's Chariots come to a close with promised goals unfulfilled. Now, according to the article, Israel's military had announced it was withdrawing its 98th Division, an elite formation of paratroopers and commando units, along with 2 reserve brigades from Gaza. The article also announced that none of the stated goals of Operation Gideon's Chariots had been achieved. The Netanyahu regime was now in a bind, with another failed attempt to defeat Hamas and to liberate its prisoners of war. That's what they are, not hostages. The Netanyahu regime needed another gimmick to prolong the slaughter. So it began to leak to the press that it would formulate a new plan to occupy the whole of Gaza. But to proceed with this plan, the Netanyahu regime had to overcome 2 huge obstacles. The first was opposition within Israel's exhausted military, and the second was the growing backlash from the international community, and particularly people of conscience the world over. As a result of these 2 obstacles, the regime announced a more limited objective for the new military operation, namely, and as I said, the so-called takeover of Gaza City. On August 6th, the day before the key meeting of Israel's Security Cabinet, the Israeli Defense Ministry's Rehabilitation Department issued a stunning announcement that received almost no attention from the Western corporate media. As you can see here, and this is in an independent media outlet, the Palestine Chronicle, the number the Rehabilitation Department gave for the number of soldiers it had treated since the Gaza war began was 80,000 soldiers. Now, the Rehabilitation Department also revealed that of those 80,000, 26,000 were suffering from mental health conditions, and it acknowledged that 33% of those mental illness cases were cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Now, according to a statement cited by the Israeli newspaper Yedioth Ahronoth, the ministry allocates more than half of its annual budget, about 4.2 billion shekels or 1.2 billion US dollars, to medical and psychological services for wounded soldiers. The Rehabilitation Department described the soaring number of casualties combined with a spike in suicides among military personnel as a, quote, major national challenge, close quote. Recently, Israel's public broadcaster, Kan, reported that 16 Israeli soldiers have taken their own lives since the start of 2025 alone. However, other sources quoted by the Israeli newspaper Mariv, including Israeli writer and analyst Ephraim Ganor, suggest that the number of military suicides since the war began may be as high as 45. Ganor warns of a, quote, silent epidemic of PTSD creeping into Israeli society, one that will become even more dangerous once the war ends and the sounds of artillery fall silent. Now, returning to this figure of 80,000 soldiers that Israel's Rehabilitation Department has treated, that constitutes about 1% of Israel's Jewish population. It also constitutes a very significant portion of Israel's total military personnel. Israel reportedly has about 170,000 active personnel and 465,000 reserve personnel for total personnel of about 635,000. 80,000 soldiers would constitute about 13% of Israel's total military personnel. What stands out about these figures, however, really stands out, is that they cannot possibly be reconciled with the official casualty figures from Israel's military. As of July 31st of this year, Israeli military data recorded that 898 Israeli soldiers had been killed in Gaza and 6,134 injured since the beginning of the war in October 2023. Now, how can the total number of injured soldiers be only 6,134 if the Israeli military's Rehabilitation Department is reporting that it has treated 80,000 soldiers? Even before the August 6th announcement that Israel's Rehabilitation Department had treated that many soldiers, senior military figures in Israel were raising serious questions about the official casualty count. For example, in March of this year, former Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon said that as many as 15,000 Israeli soldiers had been killed or wounded in the Gaza Strip since 7 October 2023, which is more than twice the number revealed by the official Israeli military data. That's far above the official casualty count, of course, but still far below the figures released by the Rehabilitation Department on August 6th of this year. When I learned of the revelation that Israel's Rehabilitation Department had treated 80,000 soldiers, I recalled from hearing interviews of many military experts that there's a wealth of data out there about the normal ratio of wounded soldiers to killed soldiers in military conflicts. So I did some research and found an article published by the U.S. National Library of Medicine in August 1999. The article is titled "Mortality Associated with the Use of Weapons in Armed Conflicts, Wartime Atrocities and Civilian Mass Shootings, Literature Review." Now, before I get to this table from the article, I'd like to say a few words about the methodology that was employed in compiling the data I'm going to talk to you about in this table. According to the authors of this study, we sought data on the number of people wounded and killed in armed conflicts or mass shootings from three sources: Medline searches official military casualty figures quoted in the medical literature and BBC Radio's World Service. We performed a search on Medline for reports that gave statistics on those wounded and killed in armed conflict since 1940. We also wrote to the chief military medical officers of 89 countries as listed in the International Committee of Military Medicine, asking for medical publications in Index Medicus that might contain official statistics on casualties. We did not ask for any confidential information. And we performed a search on Medline for reports published since 1980 that reported mass casualties of firearms outside the context of armed conflict. Ultimately, what this study found was that in the many armed conflicts and mass casualty events that the authors examined, the ratio of the number of people wounded to the number killed ranged from 1.9 to 27.8. And you can see that in the highlighted section here. The figure of 27.8 appears in the middle of the page. The second highlighted line, this is from Northern Ireland, 1970 to 1980. The ratio of wounded to killed when the injuries or deaths were caused by low velocity bullets was 27.8. And the figure of 1.9 appears just above the highlighted language, again in the middle of the page under United Kingdom. Malaya rifles, you'll see there, 1952 to 1953, 388 wounded, 204 killed, so that's a ratio of 1.9. So let's assume, for the purposes of argument, that in Israel's genocidal war in the Gaza Strip, the ratio of wounded to killed Israeli soldiers was 27.8, which is the highest ratio in this study. And let's remove from Israel's rehabilitation figures the 26,000 who were treated not for physical wounds, but for mental illness. That would leave 54,000 soldiers with physical wounds that required rehabilitation. If the ratio of wounded to killed in Gaza was the highest ratio in this study, namely 27.8 wounded per every person killed, then the number of Israeli soldiers killed would be almost 2,000, 1,942, which is more than double the official number of 898. Now, what if the Israeli military's ratio of wounded to killed in Gaza since October 2023 was the lowest ratio found in the study, 1.9? That would mean that 28,421 Israeli soldiers had been killed in this war. However you slice it, the Israeli military's official casualty figures are almost certainly a gross understatement. And the real carnage on the Israeli side is likely to be far higher. This would be perfectly consistent, by the way, with Israel's record of shameless lying. And it would also explain why so many battlefield reports from Palestinian resistance groups, and I've read hundreds of them over the past approximately 2 years, systematically indicate higher numbers of wounded and killed from the battlefield than are acknowledged, in subsequent reporting by the Israeli media, which is relying upon the very limited data provided to it by the Israeli military. But above all, this would explain why Israel's military is reported to be so strongly opposed to the prolongation and expansion of this so-called war. If it in fact has sustained far higher casualties than we were being told, certainly if the military leadership is being at all responsible vis-a-vis the soldiers it's sending into battle, it would be very reluctant to prolong this conflict and in particular to intensify it. By the way, is it a coincidence that the Rehabilitation Department disclosed these stunning numbers on August 6th, the day before Israel's Security Cabinet met to consider Netanyahu's plan to occupy Gaza? I don't believe so. I'm not a big believer in coincidences at all, particularly in circumstances such as these. A much more plausible explanation than the coincidence hypothesis is that the revelation was made consciously by the Israeli military because it wanted to pressure Netanyahu to scale back his genocidal ambitions. Now, until now, I've spoken only about the human toll on Israel's military from the genocide, but there's also the toll on its equipment. In June of last year, which would have been about 9 months or so into the genocidal war in Gaza, Israel's Mariv newspaper reported that more than 500 Israeli armored vehicles had been damaged since the start of the war. And that number is now likely to be in the thousands. Global Firepower's 2025 report on Israel's military says that Israel's military had 1,300 tanks in stock at the beginning of the year and 1,040 that were battle ready. Now, Israel's armored vehicles do not consist solely of tanks. It also has, for example, armored personnel carriers and armored bulldozers. But still, a few thousand damaged armored vehicles would be a very substantial hit to Israel's land forces. In any case, how have Palestinian resistance groups responded to the reports of a new initiative to occupy Gaza? Well, this is a statement that was put out collectively by the Palestinian resistance factions. This would have been on August 7th. And they state, regarding the leaked information circulating about the enemy government's intention to decide on the occupation of the Gaza Strip and the statements of the criminal Netanyahu regarding imposing military control over the Strip, we, the resistance factions, affirm the following. First, these statements and leaks reveal the enemy's political and field impotence after 2 years of dismal failure in achieving its goals, despite committing massacres and crimes and relying on unlimited support from global colonial powers. Second, the threat of a full military occupation of Gaza is a declaration of genocidal intentions and a desperate attempt to subjugate our people and their resistance. These intentions will not pass without a heavy price, and the field will be the decider, as it has always been. Third, Gaza is not a vacant geographical area looking for someone to fill it. Rather, it is a land saturated with the blood of martyrs and the strength of mujahideen. Any attempt at direct occupation will be a new quagmire that burns whoever penetrates it, and the resistance will enter a phase of more severe and painful confrontation for this enemy. Fourth, Netanyahu is trying to cover up his political and military defeat by marketing illusions of control. We tell him clearly, Gaza will not be managed from Tel Aviv nor from any foreign capital, but by the will of its resisting people. And fifth, the Palestinian resistance with all its factions is united in the field of confrontation, and any occupation decision will send it back from where it came, defeated and broken as always. The enemy is deluded if it thinks it will free its prisoners from the grip of the resistance by military force. We affirm that its prisoners will only be released through negotiations and at a heavy price. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Netanyahu regime announced a new plan to take over Gaza City without using the word occupy. It replaced the word occupy with takeover. Why did it do that? Well, I would think that the reason why it didn't use the word occupy is because it's well aware that in international law, an occupier has very burdensome obligations vis-a-vis the occupied people under the Geneva Conventions and the and customary international law, all of which obligations Israel has systematically violated in the most egregious and flagrant manner, not just over the past nearly 2 years of genocide, but going back decades of occupation, all the way back to 1967, when the occupation began. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what words Israel uses to describe its military presence in the Gaza Strip, and in particular, what it claims will be a new initiative to take over Gaza City, because as a legal matter, it has been definitively established that Israel is an occupier of the Gaza Strip. As I've reported previously on several occasions on Reason to Resist, there was a seminal decision by the International Court of Justice last year in which it held that both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are occupied territory for purposes of international law, and particularly international humanitarian law. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand why, whether or not you have a large presence of Israeli soldiers within the boundaries of the Gaza Strip. Israel has long controlled the borders of Gaza, exercises a painstaking supervision and control over what can get in. It has dominance of the air, relentlessly penetrates the airspace of Gaza in violation of the sovereignty of the people of Palestine, and periodically bombs the Gaza Strip, periodically sends land forces into the Gaza Strip. And it's been doing this for decades, as I say. So the clear reality, and it was high time that it be recognized by the International Court of Justice, is that the Gaza Strip is occupied. And the ICJ not only held that it is occupied, but also held that the occupation is illegal and that Israel had an obligation to bring it to an end as quickly as possible. So no amount of rhetorical gymnastics is going to alter the fact that Israel is an occupier of the Gaza Strip, and until it ends the occupation, it will be in violation of international law, whether or not, and I repeat, whether or not Hamas makes any concessions in order to secure an end to the occupation. Now, as I indicated, it's not just military brass in Israel who are opposed to a new intensified military incursion into the Gaza Strip. Israel is also confronting a tidal wave of anger from all around the world, from people of conscience. Israel's international standing is, I think it can be fairly said, in even worse shape now than its military. New polls are coming out every week which show just how battered Israel's image has become. The latest polls are unprecedented, and the polls I'm about to show you were done before the August 7th announcement of the Gaza City takeover plan, which will undoubtedly do much more damage to Israel's standing and provoke far more outrage than it has already provoked. I'm going to focus on polls from two jurisdictions, namely the United States and Canada. So first of all, let's show you the results from a poll done by Data for Progress up on the screen. This was done from August 1st to August 3rd, 2025, a survey of 1,227 US likely voters. And you'll see that the number of likely voters, the percentage of likely voters who say that Israel is committing genocide, is now nearly 50%, 47%. In April 2024, it was at 39%. And you'll also see that the number who say that Israel is not committing genocide has fallen to 33% in August this month, as compared to 38% in April of 2024. Now, this same poll came up with attitudes of Americans vis-a-vis the prioritization of humanitarian aid over the sending of weapons to Israel. And the question they were asked: which of the following do you think the U.S. should prioritize? Humanitarian aid for civilians in Gaza. 54% of likely voters said that the aid should be prioritized. Only 30% said that military aid and weapons for Israel should be prioritized. 75% of Democrats said humanitarian aid should be prioritized. And the number for independents, a substantial majority at 59%, and even Republicans, nearly a third, 29%, say that humanitarian aid should be prioritized, and slightly more than 50%, 53%, said that the sending of weapons and military aid to Israel should be given priority. Now, a third question that Data for Progress asked in this survey was: do you support or oppose the Israeli government blocking the delivery of food and medical supplies into Gaza? Frankly, my friends, it's amazing that anybody would say they support the blocking of food and medical supplies into Gaza. And not surprisingly, the vast majority of people said that they are opposed to this. The percentage of people who said that they are strongly opposed was 52%, and somewhat opposed 19%, for a total of 71%, and much less than 30% said that they strongly support or somewhat support the blocking. Amazingly, the number is this high, frankly. And of course, as you would expect, the percentage of people who in the Republican Party who said that they support the blocking of aid was 25%. 8% said they strongly support the blocking of aid. But even in the Republican, those who identified as Republican, the percentage who said they were strongly opposed to the blocking of aid was 36, and somewhat opposed was 26, for a total of 62%. So that is those are the results from the Data for Progress poll done in this month, August 2025. And anybody who's paying attention to the American media can see that there has been, I think you could fairly describe it as a sea change in the tenor of the reporting. Of course, there's still a very considerable amount of propaganda, pro-Israel propaganda, being disseminated by corporate media outlets in the United States and in other Western countries, of course. But you're seeing some pretty hard-hitting reporting, even from the likes of CNN, on what is happening in Gaza. And you even have a Republican member of the House of Representatives, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who would have thunk it, coming out and calling Israel's military operations in Gaza a genocide. So in these circumstances, the public relations landscape is going to become increasingly grim for Israel in the days ahead. Now, let's look at a recent poll in Canada. This poll was done by a well-established polling organization, Angus Reid, and they too were asked whether they believe that Israel is committing genocide. You'll see in Canada, there's actually now a majority. 52% say Israel is committing genocide, and a mere 25%, less than half that number, say that Israel is not committing genocide. Now, if we move on, we'll see in the same survey, Canadians were asked about their sympathies, and you'll see that the figure for those who sympathize more with Palestinians was in the high 30s at around 37%, whereas only 19%, so approximately half that amount or that number, said they sympathize more with Israelis. Frankly, again, it's amazing that nearly 1/5 of the Canadian population continues to have more sympathy for Israelis than Palestinians. That I think is really a testimony to the strength, the pervasiveness of pro-Israel propaganda in Canada over many years. But nonetheless, when less than 1 in 5 Canadians say that they now sympathize more with Israelis than Palestinians, Israel is in real trouble when it comes to public opinion here in Canada. And I would imagine, I don't have polls to show you, recent polls from Europe, but I would imagine we're seeing very, very similar trends in the United Kingdom and the European continent. Sensing that the tide of public opinion has shifted in a big way, Western governments are now thrashing about, looking for ways to appear sympathetic to Palestinians while doing nothing meaningful to end the genocide in Gaza. One of the most disgraceful charades that these governments are now engaging in is airdrops of humanitarian aid. Canada's government, for example, has repeatedly boasted during the past few weeks about a few paltry airdrops it's carried out over the Gaza Strip. Here, for example, is a post from the Canadian Foreign Minister, Anita Anand, on X on August 4th. This is a repost of a post by Prime Minister Goldman Sachs, as I affectionately refer to him, otherwise known as Mark J. Carney. And you'll see that Anand, my former professor of the law school that I attended at the University of Toronto, she says, much more needed aid delivered to Palestinians in Gaza today. A Canadian Armed Forces CC-130 Hercules flew a successful mission over Gaza and airdropped 21,600 pounds of aid. I continue to stay in touch with my Jordanian counterpart so that Canadian aid makes its way into Gaza. And Carney, on that same day, was also highlighting the Canadian Armed Forces airdropping life-saving aid into Gaza. He referred to this genocide as a humanitarian disaster, acknowledged it's rapidly deteriorating, but refused and has consistently refused up until now to state unequivocally that what Israel is doing is a genocide, even though now Israeli human rights organizations themselves, B'Tselem in particular, and Physicians for Human Rights Israel, have come out and accused Israel of committing a genocide. Now, Canadian leaders, particularly the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, either don't know or don't care, or both, that Palestinians and international aid groups have repeatedly condemned these airdrops as a dangerous and grossly inadequate tactic. Here, for example, is a statement from Gaza's Ministry of the Interior. This statement, published on the Resistance News Network, referred to the catastrophic effects of airdropped humanitarian aid in Gaza. This method, exploited by Israel to engineer starvation and chaos, leads to injuries, deaths, and property damage, most recently today in northern Gaza. The quantity of aid in airdrops does not even come close to that which enters from trucks. The ministry called on all nations to halt these dangerous airdrops and open land crossings for sufficient entry of aid. So you have the Gaza Health Ministry itself calling for the termination of these airdrops and the restoration of the delivery of aid by land in massive quantities. Now, it's not just the Gaza Ministry of Health, which has complained about the airdrops. 2 days ago, Nasser Hospital in Gaza reported that a Palestinian child was killed by an airdropped aid box. And here you have a report from the Quds Network, and the child's name, tragically, was Saeed Abu Yunus. He was killed while trying to retrieve airdropped aid in Khan Yunis, medical sources at Nasser Hospital confirmed. And that is not by any means the only death that has been reported from airdrops during the past few weeks. On August 8th, the Resistance News Network reported that civilians were killed both by Israeli fire and by the aid itself. Dozens of martyrs and wounded were reported after the Israeli occupation forces again targeted crowds awaiting assistance near Netzarim. In a separate incident, medic Uday Al-Karan, a medic, was martyred when an airdropped aid pallet fell directly on him. So the Palestinians themselves are demanding that this be stopped, that the aid be delivered by trucks over land, and they are reporting that a medic and a child, and there have been other casualties, have been killed by this dangerous theatrical display. And if you needed more expert input into the adequacy of this method of delivering aid, here is a statement from Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, on July 28th. They refer to airdrops in Gaza as ineffective and dangerous. They deliver less aid than trucks. They inevitably injure people when they land, and they force starving people to risk their lives for food. And we've seen plenty of video evidence to substantiate that. Now, the obvious and simple way to end Israel's starvation of Palestinians is to sanction Israel mercilessly if it refuses to allow sufficient aid to enter by land. Unlike countries such as Russia, which can withstand sanctions because of the resources at its disposal, the sophistication of its economy, the size of its population, the levels of education among the population, Israel is extremely vulnerable to sanctions. It's resource poor, its economy is small, and it's highly dependent on trade with a handful of countries, mostly from the West. And that dependency is growing rapidly as more and more people around the world refuse to do business with Israel. Airdrops are simply a method of distracting an increasingly outraged public from the fact that Western governments refuse to use their enormous leverage over Israel to end the starvation of Palestinian civilians. Another tactic that Western governments have employed to distract us from their grotesque moral bankruptcy is to announce the suspension of exports to Israel of weapons, quote, that can be used in Gaza, close quote. And the latest to try this stunt is the German Chancellor BlackRock, otherwise known as Friedrich Merz. He announced with much fanfare on August 8th that Germany would halt arms exports that Israel can use in Gaza. Now, I want to flesh out with you what that could possibly mean, that phrase, that can be used in Gaza. Well, the word can is ambiguous. Can could refer to the authorization or lack thereof that Germany has extended to Israel for the use of these German-made weapons in Gaza, or it could also refer to the technical adequacy of the weapon for use in Gaza. So, for example, in theory, you might have a weapon that for some technical reason can be used in, some theater of battle outside of Gaza, but not within Gaza. But for the life of me, I can't think of a single such weapon. A machine gun that can be used in the West Bank or in South Lebanon or Syria. Surely, from a technical perspective, it could be used in Gaza. The same is true of artillery shells. The same is true of bullets. The same is true of missiles. The same is true of bombs. The same is true, as far as I can tell, of any weapon that Israel might find useful in places like the West Bank, Syria, or Lebanon. If it's useful there, it can be used by Israel in Gaza. So I can only imagine that what is meant by the word can in this context is that Germany is sending weapons to Israel, but is telling Israel, we will not permit you. You can't use them there because we will not allow you to use them in Gaza. Now, the problem with that approach to delivering military equipment to Israel is that any assurances Israel might give to the German government about what it's going to do with those weapons, the weapons it gets from Germany, are completely and utterly worthless. No sane, rational, objective human being would think that Israel can be trusted not to use weapons in Gaza. It has violated every norm of human decency. It has been caught lying red-handed on countless occasions. There is no amount or nature of depravity of which it has proven itself incapable. No rational person and nobody who's truly committed to the defense of Palestinian human rights and an end to this genocidal onslaught in Gaza would take Israel's word when Israel says, okay, Germany, you told us we can't use these weapons in Gaza, so we're not going to use them in Gaza. But that's not the only reason why this is an outrageous approach to providing military equipment to Israel. Another reason is that Israel is not only committing atrocities in Gaza. In fact, it is also committing a genocide in the West Bank. And the West Bank is suffering genocide only at a less intense level for the time being than genocide is being perpetrated on the Palestinian population of Gaza. And of course, if the Israelis succeed in exterminating the Palestinian population of Gaza, then undoubtedly the intensity of the genocide in the West Bank will increase. But even if you don't agree with my legal assessment that Israel's genocide also extends to the West Bank, it is clear beyond a shadow of a doubt that Israel is committing major human rights violations in the West Bank. Western governments themselves acknowledge that Israeli settlers, with the connivance of the Israeli military, are carrying out attacks. Really, they are more properly described as pogroms on the indigenous Palestinian population of the West Bank. Western governments themselves acknowledge that Israel's settlements are illegal and are a war crime, a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention and customary international law. There is collective punishment going on, the destruction of Palestinian farmlands, of Palestinian civilian infrastructure. People are being shot in the streets. There was a person who featured recently, a Palestinian who became famous through an Oscar-winning documentary about a community in the West Bank. And there doesn't appear to be any accountability forthcoming for the crazed Israeli settler who shot him dead. So why would why would the German government think it's okay for Israel to use German-made weapons in the West Bank? Or what about the south of Lebanon, where Israel has committed every war crime imaginable and laid waste, literally demolished? I saw this with my own eyes on repeated visits to the south of Lebanon over the last 20 months, demolished one village after another, has attacked medics, other emergency workers, attacked hospitals. Why would you think that it is acceptable, Frederick Merz, for Israel to employ German-made weapons in South Lebanon? And of course, there's Israel's crimes in Syria, Israel's crimes against the people of Yemen, Israel's war of aggression against the Islamic Republic of Iran. There is simply no excuse for any Western government, any government on God's green earth, to be providing any military equipment to Israel at all, or to be purchasing military equipment from the government of Israel or from Israeli corporations that are complicit in Israel's human rights violations. It wasn't just, by the way, Frederick Merz that is engaging in this, kabuki theater, saying we're suspending the delivery of German-made weapons to Israel that can be used in Gaza. No, that sorry-ass technique or tactic is also being employed by the Canadian government. On August 2nd, after several Canadian human rights organizations, through their intrepid reporting and analysis, revealed that Canadian-made weapons continue to flow to Israel, and this despite the denials of the Canadian government. Foreign Minister Anita Anand issued a statement, and in it she said, quote, "Canada has drawn and will continue to draw a hard line. Since January 2024, we have refused any new permits for controlled goods that could be used in Gaza. Not one has been approved. We went further by freezing all existing permits in 2024 that could have allowed military components to be used in Gaza, and those permits remain suspended today." Now, if the Canadian government had ended all military equipment deliveries to Israel for any purpose whatsoever, why would it have said that could be used in Gaza? Why is Minister Anand using that language? The obvious implication is that the Canadian government has allowed military equipment to be sent to Israel for what it regards as purposes other than waging war upon Gaza. But as I've said, no assurances Israel can give about what it does with Canadian-made weapons have any credibility whatsoever. And even if they did, those assurances could be taken seriously. Why would Canada allow a state that is committing genocide not only in Gaza but in the West Bank, and is committing atrocities all over West Asia, including in South Lebanon and Syria, and violating international law, allow any military equipment whatsoever to be sent to the Israeli regime? Or why would it allow Canadians or itself, the Canadian government, to purchase Israeli-made weaponry from corporations, Israeli corporations that are profiting from this genocide, which is exactly what Canada is doing. And the statement issued by Minister Anita Anand on August 2nd did not address that fact, that Canada is buying weapons in amounts of millions of dollars from the genocidal entity or corporations in the genocidal entity that are profiting from the genocide. Now, a third tactic that Western leaders are using to distract us from their complicity is to pretend that they're really, really, really pissed off with Benjamin Netanyahu. So have a look at this, folks. You'll see here on the right side of the screen a report in the Times of Israel from last week. Trump yelled at Netanyahu over PM's denial of hunger in Gaza. PMO fake news. That was information that was leaked to the Times of Israel. Well, guess what? I saw this report and I immediately recalled having seen something very similar last year. On the left side of the screen, you can see another Times of Israel report from October 2024. quoting Biden. Again, this was anonymous sources leaking the information to the press. "Bibi, you've got no strategy." Biden said to yell at Netanyahu and call him liar and son of a bitch. And yet somehow magically, despite all of this purported anger and fury being directed at Netanyahu and all of this mistrust, the weapons just keep flowing. Not only do the weapons keep flowing from the United States to Israel, but the United States is sanctioning human rights experts who are simply trying to draw attention to Israel's crimes. And they're sanctioning lawyers at the International Criminal Court who are trying to hold these war criminals, these Israeli war criminals, accountable for their crimes. They're vetoing resolutions at the UN Security Council. They're providing economic aid to Israel. They're lying shamelessly on Israel's behalf. There is absolutely no reason to believe that if the president of the United States, whether it be Biden or Trump, was so angry and so distrustful of Netanyahu, that they would continue to do everything conceivable, I repeat, everything conceivable, to enable his genocide in occupied Palestine. But my friends, the good news is this. It is that all of these charades that we're now seeing stink of desperation. These airdrops and, these leaks to the media that, the president of the United States is angry as hell and he isn't going to take it anymore from Netanyahu. And these, flamboyant announcements that Western governments are cutting off the flow of weapons that can be used in Gaza. They are kabuki theater, but they're signs of desperation. It's very clear that they're feeling the heat, and the reason for which they're feeling the heat, and the polling shows this beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that there has been a tidal wave, a shift really amounting to a tidal wave in public opinion, and it's just going to get worse from here. So my final message to you, and it's one you may be tired of hearing me repeat, but it bears repeating, is escalate, escalate, escalate. And in that regard, I want to give a shout out to the dozens of activists in Montreal who showed up outside the home of the former Canadian Foreign Minister, Melanie Joly. She continues to be a minister in the Canadian government, albeit with a different portfolio, to denounce her complicity in this genocide. Of course, the entire Canadian political elite, including political adversaries of the Liberals and Melanie Joly, denounced this. They denounced the fact that these peaceful anti-genocide protesters showed up outside the home of Melanie Joly. But that's not because they care about Melanie Joly. What they're afraid of, my friends, is that they will be next. And you should make damn sure that that's exactly what happens. Anybody in the political elite who supports Israel, if you can find out where they live, go stand outside their house and peacefully protest and draw attention to their entire community that they are complicit in this genocide. For now, this is Dimitri Lascaris signing off from Greece on August 9th, 2025.